I trained at ATP Flight School, and here's the truth about it. If you guys are new to the channel, I'm going to give you a quick run through of who I am, where I trained, and where I am now. To start, I trained at ATP Flight School in 2017, and I finished in January of 2018. After ATP Flight School, I was a flight instructor for about 3 months, and then I got hired at a company called JSX, and then from there, I was at JSX for about 4.5 years before getting hired at my current air carrier, which is a major airline in the United States. To start, I'm going to quickly go over my experience at ATP, and then after that we're going to talk about the pros and the cons of ATP and whether or not I'd recommend ATP for you. So I went to the Mesa Gateway campus, and the one thing that I really loved about this campus is, one, it was new. Two, it has a lot of newer aircraft ATP purchases. So there was a good mixture of steam gauge versus G1000 aircraft. This was really cool because when I started off with my training, private, instrument, commercial, I did mainly steam gauge, and then after that, I would dabble between doing G1000 and steam gauge. And this is really good because it allowed me to get experience and proficiency and comfort in both types of avionics systems. In the real world, it's more than likely that you'll fly something that's a little bit more similar to the G1000, but there is a possibility as you knock out your low time hours and your low time jobs that you might find yourself in an aircraft that has old school steam gauge avionics. And it's good to get that experience going through flight training, getting comfortable with steam gauge. That way, when you get to the real world, you're not trying to figure out and get comfortable and redo your scan to learn how to fly steam gauge. So let's talk about the pros and the cons of ATP. One of the big pros for me is that ATP is a fast-paced program. And as you guys have probably seen, there are so many flight schools out there that say that they are fast-paced, and they're really not. And usually the problem is they create a fast-paced program, then they don't have enough instructors, or they don't have enough aircraft, or they have too many students, or the maintenance is too far behind. And when you add all these issues on, it makes it really hard for you to actually get done in the time frame that they say. Now, when I was at ATP, in my experience there was always enough instructors, there were always enough aircraft, and the scheduling was easy enough, and the weather, at least in Phoenix, was good enough that we never really had weather delays. So when they said, we'll get you done in 9 months, we'll get you done in 12 months, I was pretty confident that we'd be able to get done in that time. As a matter of fact, I was able to finish the 9-month program about a month early, so that was really convenient, and we're going to talk about that more here later in the video. The other thing that I really like about the program, and I kind of touched on it earlier, is that it's a well-defined and tested program. Their fast track program has been around for many decades now, and because of that, any of the kinks and inefficiencies have been ironed out and fixed so that when you get into the program, it's a very streamlined experience. There's a lot of flight schools where, as I said earlier, they just started their program, and when you are a fresh student in a new program, you're oftentimes kind of the guinea pig as they try to figure out, well, what works and what does not work, whether or not they have the capacity to meet the demand. And at ATP, because they've already been through all those growing pains, it's a pretty safe bet that you'll be able to get through the course in the time frame they said, as long as you commit to your part. Of course, there are things that are out of control and there are incidents that happen, but for the most part, I think that you can pretty safely count on getting done in a reasonable amount of time if you go to ATP. Another benefit of ATP is that the expectations of the student are clear from the start. They kind of, at least when I went through, they gave us a handbook of sorts, and you read through it, and the handbook was very clear about what the school's expectations were of you as a student when it came to professionalism and knowledge. So you knew how you needed to dress, how you needed to look, and more importantly, you knew how the knowledge was going to work. You knew what information you were expected to know and when, and you knew that when you came to school the next day, when you left school that night, that you needed to study that night and come to school the next day prepared to build on the information that you had learned the previous night, so that way the course could keep going. And I feel like there are some schools out there where the expectations of you as a student are always clear, so that can lead to times where perhaps you weren't quite prepared because you weren't exactly sure what the school wanted you to do, and that can lead to a slowdown in the training side. And at ATP, me personally, I never experienced that problem because, again, the expectations were very clear from the start. The program is also mimicked to kind of represent airline operations, and this is really important because once you get to the airlines and air carriers, there's a very specific way that they kind of do things, and ATP kind of helps mold you into that mindset from the way that they do their flows and the memory items and the checklist. It's built to kind of mimic how you would do it at the airlines, and so that way when you get to your first airline or air carrier, you're a little bit more familiar with the setup of how they do things, and that way when you get there, it's not your first time, you're not caught off guard, and you're already ready to move into the professional world of aviation. This isn't too much of a pro these days, but back when I went through it was, and that is that ATP has financing available. When I was going through flight training looking for a flight school, if you didn't have the money to pay for flight school, you pretty much had two options. You could either go to ATP and use their financing program, and their financing program was still very restricted restrictive. Or you could go through college and use a combination of scholarships, government money, and loans to pay for your flight training. I personally didn't want to go through college to get my flight training just because I knew it was going to take a lot longer, and I also didn't want to go the military route. And so for me, going to flight school and getting it done as quickly as possible is the best choice. And thankfully, I was able to pull some strings and get some help to allow me to apply and qualify for the ATP financing. Nowadays, most flight schools have partnerships with banks that specialize in student loans for student pilots. And this is a lot more convenient because the requirements are a lot more manageable and realistic compared to what they were when I went through. So that's why I say nowadays it's not too much for pro, but when I went through, it was definitely a big pro for myself. The two last things that I think are really big pros for ATP, the first one being that the financing was very transparent. And I think that you'll hear a variety of different stories on this. When I was going through, a lot of people said that they were not transparent when it came to finances, but for me, they were. And I'll say this story. So I finished about a month early when I went to ATP, and I wasn't keeping track of how many hours I had allotted in the program versus how many hours I actually used. But because I was finishing about a month early, there were a set amount of hours that I had not used that were available to me. So when I got close to graduating the program, ATP calls me up and they say, hey, you have some extra hours. Do you want to use them up, or do you want us to just shoot you a check? And of course I say, yeah, just send me a check. And for me, this is really cool because like I said, I was not keeping track of my hours. So if there would have been a situation where I didn't keep track of my hours, which I didn't, and they decided not to call me, I would have never had any idea in the world that they owed me money. But as a good business does, they took it on themselves. They gave me a call and they said, hey, it looks like you're gonna have these extra hours available to you. Would you like a check? And I said yes, and I was able to get a check, a refund for the difference between how many hours I actually used versus how many hours were available to me in the program. And then the last reason that I think the ATP is a good program for most people is that they are available nationwide. Odds are, if you want to go to ATP, you more than likely live near a location. I think this is very convenient for people who want to go to flight training and go to a reputable flight school, but they don't want to move. This can be a great option because, like I said, there is more than likely a campus near you. However, I always tell people if you want to go to ATP, I recommend that you go to the Mesa Gateway campus because Phoenix has the best weather. That campus always gets new airplanes, and there's a lot of money constantly being invested into that campus, whether it be just the overall cosmetic state of it, to the simulators, to the aircraft, to the maintenance. And you do get a fair amount of airline traffic going in and out of that airport as well. So you can get a good mixture of experience and training when you go to that location. If you don't want to go to the Mesa Gateway location, the other two locations that I think are fairly nice is the Jacksonville location down in Florida. I think that is probably the nicest location because I think that's where they're headquartered at. And then Long Beach, California is also a nice location as well. So those are the pros, okay? Now let's talk about the cons, because of course ATP definitely has some cons. And the biggest con is also, in my opinion, the biggest pro is that it is a fast-paced program. So why is this a con? Well, if you are somebody who likes a college-like environment, a classroom environment with an instructor, and somebody who is there that is dedicated to just teaching you ground knowledge, then ATP is probably not the best choice for you. That being said, most of their ground instruction is done online via module courses. You get most of your knowledge through that, and then the next day, you and your instructor will kind of review that knowledge and see if there's any gaps in what you understood, and then fill in the gaps, and then that's pretty much your ground training. There are a lot of flight schools out there where the ground training is you in a class with an instructor, and you guys methodically go through all the details. And if that is the kind of program that you like, then perhaps ATP may not be the best choice for you. Another con is that the price is really expensive. If you already have a private pilot's license and you enter into ATP, you can expect to pay somewhere between, I think it was $88,000 and $90,000. If you do not have a private pilot's license, I believe the program costs about $116,000. That's pretty expensive, and it would not be hard for you to go research and find a cheaper flight school. But of course, that flight school may not have certain amenities or features that you like the ATP does have. So it'll be up to you to figure out whether the extra cost of ATP is worth it or not, or would you rather go to a different flight school that's cheaper? This is really just about you figuring out what is important to you and what is not important to you. And then the last thing I think is kind of a con about ATP, at least when I was going through, is not all the locations are nice. The three locations that I listed, Long Beach, Phoenix, and Jacksonville, those are all nice locations, but there are also some locations that I had been to that were kind of just like shacks, you know what I mean? And those are locations where if I was paying $116,000 for my flight training, I'd be a little bit disappointed that it wasn't inside of a nicer facility. So if that's something that's important to you, make sure that you do an exploratory flight and check out the grounds, check out the campus, and make sure that it is aesthetically pleasing to you and that it's someplace where you don't mind putting a lot of money and spending a lot of time. So with all that being said, do I recommend ATP for you? Well, the answer answer is yes, and for some of you, no. If you're somebody who likes the fast-paced learning style, who likes to work independently, who can pick up knowledge quickly, then ATP is a great place for you. If you're somebody who prefers a more old school environment where you're in a classroom with a variety of different people, with an instructor whose job it is to specifically teach you ground knowledge, then ATP may not be the best choice for you. That being said, even if you are somebody who's a bit of a slower learner, ATP can still be good for you if you're willing to put in the extra work, just because it'll get you prepared for the fast-paced learning that can be present at some air carriers. And I say this because I think that it is better to learn how to work in that kind of environment at ATP. And if you get like a check ride failure or some kind of failure at ATP, you get it when it's not all that critical compared to getting into a fast-paced environment for the first time when you're at your first air carrier and you're going through training, whether it be at a Part 135 or 121 carrier. Then if you get a check ride failure, it is a lot more detrimental to your career. So I always recommend, even if you aren't the fastest learner, it's okay, but ATP can still be a great opportunity for you to learn how to keep up and get with the curve, because there are some companies where if you do fall a little bit behind, they'll give you an extra sim session or an extra ground session to help you catch up. But on the flip side, there are also a lot of companies where if you cannot keep up, they will simply let you go and hire somebody who can keep up. So you want to be able to make sure that when you get hired, you can keep up with the flow of training and exceed any and all expectations and do an excellent job.